Hello, everyone. This is Allie with Globalistas Art. Today, we're going to talk about European and American art from 1715 to 1840 and look at the works by John Singleton Copley. The key works that we're going to look at are Copley's Thomas Mifflin and Sarah Morris, otherwise known as Mr. and Mrs. Mifflin, and Copley's Watson and the Shark. Our key terms are the Academy, which is an institution established for the training of artists. Academies date from the Renaissance and after. They are particularly powerful in state-run institutions in the 17th and 18th centuries. In general, academies replaced guilds as the venues where students learned the craft of art and were educated in art theory. Academies helped the recognition of artists as trained specialists rather than craftspeople and promoted their social status. An academician was an academy-trained artist. So essentially in the 17th century, you had what was known as the establishment of the academies. And what this did was actually, so in France, you had Louis XIV, the Sun King, who didn't really like that the culture of his people were essentially run by the guilds. And so what he did was he consolidated many of the guilds into what are known as the Beaux-Arts, which are typically sculpture, painting, and architecture. And he put these arts under the state rather than the guilds. And then in the 18th century, you had the establishment of the Royal Academy of Art in England. And this one was run by, the first one was basically run by Charles Lebrun in France. And he painted art that celebrated the king because at the time, the king was an absolute monarch. And then in the 18th century, you had the English establish the Royal Academy of Art, and this was run by Joshua Reynolds. And within the academy, you have now almost a little caste system for genres. So genres are basically just the type of painting. So the status of painting genres according to the academy, these were codified in the 17th century, and the most important types of paintings were history paintings. These are based on historical, mythological, or biblical narratives. They usually convey a high moral or intellectual idea. History paintings are typically very large, and when they are shown at the annual exhibition, history paintings are also usually placed at the very top of the gallery hang. And in these academic exhibitions, you have a floor to ceiling hang where every little part of the wall is covered. And at the very top, you'd see these kind of massive history paintings. Then the next on the list are portraiture, and these are just paintings of person. What Joshua Reynolds did in England, because there weren't a lot of commissions for history paintings, which was he combined the portraiture and history painting to create basically history portraits. And history portraits are when you place the sitter or the subject within the context of the of a situation. So for instance, you might have a painting of a general who is placed within a battle scene. Then genre paintings, and genre paintings are scenes of everyday life of ordinary people in work or recreation. Landscape paintings, depictions of natural scenery and art. Landscape paintings may capture mountains, valleys, bodies of water, fields, forests, and coasts, and may or may not include man-made structures as well as people. And then finally, still lifes, which are depictions of inanimate objects such as flowers or fruits. So when we're looking at the work of John Singleton Copley, we're going to, it's basically, we're in America, even though his life actually ends in England. And he is a really important painter during the American Revolution. So important events in the American Revolution are the Proclamation of 1763, and this was basically at the ending of the French and Indian War. You had the English crown basically saying colonists couldn't settle past the Appalachian Mountains, and the colonists were taxed because of this. And then you had the Sugar Act, which placed a tax on molasses, and then the Stamp Act, which placed a tax on essentially um, stamping legal documents. Then the Stamp Act is repealed because this causes an uproar, most notably with Samuel Adams, who essentially makes the phrase taxation without representation is tyranny very popular and starts rallying people against British rule. Then you have the Townshend Acts, the Boston Massacre, the Tea Act, and then the Boston Tea Party, the Coercive Acts, the Intolerable Acts, Battles of Lexington and Concord. Washington takes command of the army. We have the Declaration of Independence, which is written. Americans win the Battle of Saratoga. France comes in and gives America supplies and men. The war then shifts to the southern colonies, and the colonists actually partake in guerrilla warfare um, to defeat the British. And then finally, the American colonists win, and you have Cornwallis surrendering in Yorktown, Virginia. And in 1783, Americans and British signed the Treaty of Paris, ending the war. And a fabulous part of culture that depicts one of our founding fathers, Alexander Hamilton, is the Hamilton musical, which actually has a lot of historical information about the American Revolution and then the formation of the American government. And then in 1775 to 1783, we were looking at art in the American Revolution. And so the American Revolution was a series of dramatic events that had many heroic people that needed to be memorialized in images. The new nation needed a history, and this history needed to be represented visually. And then we had portraits and history paintings that were needed to basically memorialize these figures. The US also needed new educational institutions to educate citizens about the values of the new nations. And then academies of art established not only to train artists, but to invest in the profession and create a sense of tradition. So you had politicians and businessmen who wanted to show the newness of the nation, but also wanted the new nation to have historical legitimacy. So therefore, there was inclusion of many classical forms, such as these neoclassical buildings, where you had temple fronts on buildings, temple fronts that looked basically like the Parthenon. Then many thought that American taste was not on the same level as Europe, and this actually would continue essentially until until World War II, where you had this kind of mass influx of European artists coming into America. And a great resource to look at the American Revolution is Crash Course, which I really like looking at these videos for just kind of these historical moments in a nutshell. And now let's look at John Singleton Copley. So John Singleton Copley lived from 1738 to 1815. He's most associated with Boston, and Boston has an area essentially in the middle of Boston proper, called Copley Square, named after the artist. He's a New England painter. He's known for his portraits in the American Revolution, but keep in mind that he painted both loyalists and patriots because he didn't know who was going to win the war, and he had to make sure that he would have a career after the war. He was born in 1738. His mother owned a tobacco shop, and his father was ill and went to the West Indies and actually died when Copley was just a baby. His mother then remarried to Peter Pelham, and Pelham was able to teach Copley mezzotint. And so mezzotint is basically just this intaglio process where you kind of scratch with a metal, almost like a pencil, into a metal plate a drawing. So you're basically drawing on a metal plate, and then you can print that plate. But Pelham died when Copley was 13, so then Copley starts training himself to become the best artist he can be so that he can get commissions. And so from this time forward, he's essentially self-trained. And he becomes one of the most sought-after portraitists in the colonies, and he lives in Boston. He's known for his ability to render texture, display the subject's personality, and include symbols of the person's status in his portraits. In 1774, he goes to England to go on his Grand Tour, and the Grand Tour was popular during the 18th and 19th centuries. It was an extended tour of cultural sites in France and Italy, intended to finish the education of a young upper-class person, primarily for Britain or America. So this is essentially kind of like taking a semester abroad, except you would go with an entourage, essentially. And you would start, if you were in the American colonies, you would then go to London. If you were English, you would start in London and then go to Paris, the south of France, Venice, Florence, Naples, and end in Rome. And he is known for a portraiture, which is a painting of a person. So now let's look at his largest work, which he painted in England, which is his family. And here we're able to see his ability to render textures and show the personality of each of his sitters. He was able to look at works by Raphael and other artists from Italy, and here we can see similarities with atmospheric perspective in Raphael's Madonna of the Goldfinch, which is similar in Copley's portrait of his family. And then also in this rendering of Madonna with John the Baptist and Christ Child, you have this pyramidal composition which he recreates in the image of his wife with two of his children. So here we see that he has 4 children, but actually one of his children died during childhood, and this was very common at the time for a variety of reasons, including that they didn't have modern medicine in this period. And over here is Copley's stepfather, and here is the artist who's looking out at us. And we can see his ability to emulate textures in paint with the fabrics and then the backgrounds. And we have other fabrics within the drapery of his wife's dress and the chair, as well as the rug. And this would have been his largest work. But if we kind of rewind and look at his earlier works, this is a painting called Henry Pelham, which was his half-brother, and it's sometimes known as Boy with a Squirrel. He actually painted this in 1765, and he sent it to England almost as a sampler to show people in England what he could do so that he might obtain an offer to then go to England to paint there or to receive more commissions. And this is just a masterwork when it comes to textures. Look at Henry Pelham's hair. It's almost as though you can touch it. And then we have other textures with the gold chain, the little squirrel, the squirrel's bushy tail, the wood of the table, the glass, the water in the glass, and then the fabrics with the drapery and Henry Pelham's outfit, as well as his skin tones. And this is a bit interesting because here we almost have a pyramidal composition, which would emulate the Italian Renaissance, but then he's actually looking out in this open form that's more reminiscent of Baroque work, where we can tell that the scene extends beyond the canvas. So, some scholars have thought that this could be shown as a balance or a need for a balance between man and nature, as um, Henry is carefully balancing this gold chain, as well as the squirrel is doing the same thing. And then it might also reflect the balance of the colonies. And then here we see this same kind of halfway mark in the glass. And when this was sent to England, Joshua Reynolds, who was the head of the Royal Academy, um, complimented Copley's work and thought that he had talent, but he almost gave it kind of like a backhanded compliment, where it was like it was a good painting for an American. Another one of Copley's signature works that show one of the things that Copley is most known for, which is including symbols of the sitter's career and status, and a lot of times political leanings within his paintings, is the portrait of Paul Revere. So Paul Revere was one of the Sons of Liberties. He was a master silversmith, and here he has his silver teapot. But when you were a metal worker, you were also trained in engraving, and therefore he was able to create etchings. And one of his most famous etchings is the etching of the which then became a print of the Boston Massacre, which was actually created after Henry Pelham's work of the same subject. And then he also engraved what is known as the Liberty Bowl with the names of the Sons of Liberty. And this is exhibited in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston in front of Paul Revere's portrait and with other portraits by Copley. However, this would have actually, and all of these portraits would have been hung in the private homes of the sitters. Here we see Revere has this kind of directness that's associated with Americans, and his ability to work hard, kind of establish his craft. Paul Revere would have known pretty much everyone in Boston at the time, and this painting would have been in his house until and part of his family until the Great Depression, when many people had to part with their works because they needed money, and it was sold to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Here is Paul Revere's house, which has been turned into a museum, which is in the north end of Boston, which I highly recommend if you visit Boston to go to both Paul Revere's house and the Museum of Fine Arts. When I taught this image in a class, I put up this portrait and I asked the students, who is this? And everyone said at the same time, Jack Black. And I actually couldn't believe how much Jack Black looks like Paul Revere. And there are actually quite a few memes out there about the similarities between Paul Revere's aesthetic and Jack Black's. And now let's look at one of our key works. So this is a double portrait of Thomas Mifflin and his wife, Sarah Morris. So Copley is known for textures, but also incorporating aspects into the painting that tell about the sitter. So here we see that these are a relatively well-to-do couple, and we can tell this because of the fabrics of Sarah Morris's dress, and also the fabrics and the suiting of her husband, Thomas Mifflin. Mifflin was a prominent merchant and politician, and they were both on the sides of the Patriots. And we can tell this because Sarah is actually not wearing kind of these dramatic adornments with, even though her fabrics are fine, they're not kind of overly embellished, and she doesn't have lots of jewelry. Instead, she just has a simple choker on. And she is here attending to a domestic task, which shows where she would have worked within the realm of society at the time. And then Thomas Mifflin actually stops reading, which shows that he is an intellectual, to gaze at his wife lovingly, which implies that they had a very nice relationship and that they were both hardworking, just in the different positions that were allowed to them at the time. And what's also interesting is that Sarah, rather than Thomas, is the center of this portrait, which might also show her kind of center status as of her household. And the same year, the colonists protested the British tax on tea, and the British staged the Boston Tea Party, where they seized British tea and tossed it into the harbor. And so this portrait, even though it was commissioned in Boston when the couple most likely was visiting Boston for a funeral, it would have been hung in the couple's house in Philadelphia. And here we have an example of a history painting. And a history painting is a painting based on historical, mythological, or biblical narratives, and it usually conveys a high moral or intellectual idea. This is our second key work, and it is Watson and the Shark. Copley actually painted 3 versions of this painting. The first one was he gave to Brooke Watson, who commissioned this portrait. Brooke Watson was a London merchant, and remember, Copley visited England in 1774, where he would live until his death. Brooke Watson was an English politician who actually became the mayor of London. However, in 1749, he was working on a boat in Havana, Cuba, and he actually fell into the water and was attacked by a shark. And the shark bit him and actually bit off the lower portion of his leg and foot down here. And he survived after 3 attempts of people trying to save him. And Watson hired Copley to paint the event to show his ability to overcome struggles and also overcome pretty much different the elements and then different kind of problems that life and the world are going to give each person during their life. So, however, Copley was very adept at painting people, and here we can see the different expressions of each of the people's faces. This person was actually initially a younger person, and then he redid this person to make him an older sailor. And then he had never visited Cuba, and the water almost looks like water that you might see in Boston, although it's a little bit more turquoisey to make it appear like the Caribbean. And he looked at paintings and prints of the Havana harbor to paint the harbor, and he actually did a pretty good job with that. However, he didn't know about shark's anatomy. And so here we see this kind of almost like fanciful rendering of a shark, which kind of reminds me of Durer's rhinoceros, where the artist just didn't know the exact anatomy of the animal. And the shark actually has these flaring nostrils, which is kind of comical as he's going to bite Watson. And keep in mind that here we have that Copley, went on his grand tour, was able to look at Italian artists, and we have almost this classical rendering of Watson, which almost looks like a work of Michelangelo. And again, we have our pyramidal composition in the forefront. But then also this painting was commissioned by an Englishman who would have been on the English side of the American Revolution. And he, like many English people at the time, thought that a lot of what the revolution stood for was hypocritical, because the American colonists wanted freedom from the British crown, yet still partook in the slave trade and slavery. And so here we have the inclusion of this figure, which might point to the hypocrisy of the American Revolution and uh, the commissioners' political leanings and thoughts on the subject. So we have three versions, and the second version is at the MFA Boston, and it's actually the same size as this painting. And Copley actually painted it for himself, and then he created a third, smaller version, which is at the Detroit Institute of Arts. All right, thank you so much, and I hope you enjoyed this talk.